Secretary Hagel served 2 terms in the United States Senate from 1997 to 2009, representing the great state of Nebraska, and was a senior member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as well as serving on the Banking, Housing and Urban Affairs and Intelligence Committees. Secretary Hagel was a distinguished professor at Georgetown University and has served in an advisory capacity on a number of advisory boards and commissions. Prior to his election to the US Senate, Secretary Hagel was president of McCarthy and Company, an investment banking firm in Omaha. And beyond a number of successful pursuits in the private sector, Secretary Hagel also served as Deputy Administrator of the Veterans Administration under President Ronald Reagan and Deputy Commissioner General of the 1982 World's Fair. He's the author of the book, America, Our Next Chapter, and was the subject of 2 books, one, Our Year of War, and another, Chuck Hagel Moving Forward, and is a graduate of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. The Honorable Bob Carey serves as Managing Director at Allen and Company and as the Executive Chairman of the Minerva Institute for Research and Scholarship. And from 2001 to 2011, Mr. Carey was president of the New School, which experienced unprecedented growth and international engagement under his leadership. From 1989 to 2001, Mr. Carey represented, again, the great state of Nebraska in the Senate, where he promoted equity for rural communities, led in farm and environmental legislation, strengthened taxpayers' rights, led in restructuring the intelligence agencies, and partnered with local leaders to build projects of lasting value to Nebraskans. His public service since leaving the Senate includes a number of board and councils. And prior to his Senate service, Mr. Carey served 1 term as Nebraska's governor. And before entering politics, he was a businessman who helped build a chain of restaurants and health clubs employing over 1,000 people. Mr. Carey served as a US Navy SEAL during the Vietnam War, and for his service, he received a Medal of Honor. Mr. Carey earned a BS degree in pharmacy from the University of Nebraska, not Omaha, Lincoln. So I hope that you will please join me in virtually welcoming our distinguished guests, Secretary Hagel and Senator Carey. A warm welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining us, and representatives from the unicameral today. We're going to talk first a little bit about the COVID response as it relates to the state of Nebraska. And for a little context for you both before the first question, just wanted to let everyone present know that within days of the first confirmed case of COVID-19 in Nebraska, Lutheran Family Services shifted our work to a work from home environment. And we activated more than 45 secure virtual telehealth therapy rooms from 6. And by December of this past year, LFS had conducted more than 45,000 telehealth sessions in more than 60 virtual therapy rooms, serving people across the state and the region. And that number continues to grow as churches from Sydney and Alliance to Fairbury and Lincoln partner with LFS to provide safety and welcoming satellite telehealth locations. LFS was also selected by the state of Nebraska to distribute $2.3 million of direct service to individuals and families impacted by the pandemic. And more than 3,000 applications were received for much needed financial assistance that helped families with rent, mortgage, utilities, basic needs, as well as tablets and smartphones with connectivity for access to telehealth, remote learning, employment, applications, and more. And these responses, as you know, only scratch the surface and don't tell the full story of what's currently at play and what we'll need to do together to repair and rebuild. So my question for you, first and foremost, is how have you and families been faring during the pandemic? And secondly, what signs of hope do you see in the response of Nebraskans in particular to this crisis? And whoever would like to go first, please.
You go first, Chuck.
Well, I should defer to you, Bob. You're the senior senator.
Well, I mean, my guess is, Chuck, is you and I are similar in some ways. We've both been very lucky. I've spent most of my time either in the city or at we have a little house out on Shelter Island, about 70 miles east of here. But I work for Allen Company, and the CEO of Allen Company sent us all a note first week of March, said, two things: don't come to work until I tell you to, and secondly, we have enough cash to pay you all until you're able to come back to work. So, I mean, that's an unusual situation, and so I feel very, very fortunate. Also, having become eligible for federal subsidies through the VA by getting blown up in a war, it's a pretty high threshold, but I haven't had to really worry about particularly getting vaccinated. I have been vaccinated already, and so I feel like I should get up every morning and try to, being grateful that I've gotten through this with almost no serious change. I've had a couple of friends who have gotten sick and one who died, but it's mostly in terms of suffering. I've experienced almost nothing during this pandemic.
Well, Bob, I'm like you, very fortunate. My family is very fortunate that we have not been affected, other than how all Americans have been affected by COVID. Both Leibet and I have gotten both shots. Our family is okay. We live in McLean, Virginia, right outside of Washington. And it's like any other, I think, area, metropolitan area. You just follow the guidelines, don't do stupid things, wear your masks, and just take responsible action. I don't think there's anything complicated to it, but we've been fortunate that we haven't had any circumstances that would put us in dangerous or vulnerable spots. Most all of our friends are in pretty good shape. I mean, I have not been back to Nebraska since last March. I mean, we just haven't traveled. And my brother and cousins and so on in Nebraska and Omaha, friends I talk to all the time, kind of keep me informed. But I think Nebraska is not unlike the rest of the country. We're all making progress. We're not there. I know the administration and their new leaders and doctors are concerned about a renewed surge in COVID exposures, and we'll see how that works. But I think there's good news because the vaccinations are getting out, people are receiving them, and that's probably the most important thing that we can do to really get our country, our citizens vaccinated, to try to get a hold of this thing. So we've got a ways to go. I know Nebraska's in the same situation, but again, I would say we've been very fortunate, like you, Bob.
I'm glad to hear that you're both faring okay, and so are your families. That's great news. And I'm wondering, from your respective seats of expertise and experience, what opportunities you see that have arisen from this crisis, and what recommendations you might have for current public servants as they look 1, 3, 5 years ahead of a post-pandemic or a hopeful post-pandemic world.
Well, first of all, I think it's very important that Nebraskans continue to support entities like Lutheran Family Services. I mean, you're doing things that the private sector can't do, that the government can't do, and there's a substantial amount of need, childcare need, healthcare need, particularly mental health need coming out of this. I mean, it produced a tremendous amount of stress for small business people in the service economy. I mean, as blessed as I've been, I recognize that for an awful lot of people, they've not been so blessed. And so I think, and mental health in particular is it's exceptionally difficult to keep people focused on, because it sort of comes and goes. So I really applaud you and LFS and all your donors, because you're just doing spectacular things, it seems to me, to improve the quality of life in the state.
Well, I echo everything Bob said, especially in recognizing Lutheran Family Services. And Stacy, your leadership, all of your team there, thank you. And thanks for obviously having us on and making us part of the program today to share some thoughts. But Bob said something particularly important, I think: mental health. And when I talk, at least in my opinion, speak of mental health, I mean, it's wider and deeper than maybe just a clinical definition of mental health. Because what this country has been exposed to the last year, and every facet of our society and our culture has been hit by this, not just our economy and not just government responsibilities and functions and all that goes with it, but it's the total of healthcare. And what Lutheran Family Services has done over the years, and especially you're doing now to address that, is important. I think as to how we look at the future and what's ahead. I mean, obviously, Bob and I are not in Nebraska. The state senators and others on this call are far better positioned than Bob and me to talk about the future of Nebraska. But I would offer this thought. Nebraska is, I think, and it really has been, but I think particularly now, uniquely positioned because of one factor among many: quality of life. I think one of the things that's been impressed upon all of us in this country the last year is quality of life. I mean, you can have a lot of money, a couple of houses, or whatever you got, or whatever you don't have. But quality of life now becomes, I think, as important as it's been since World War II. And I think you're seeing that in people moving out of metropolitan areas, moving to rural areas, real estate booming in certain areas. And I think Nebraska is uniquely positioned because the entire environment of quality of life Nebraska represents: the people, the advantages you have out there, the industries that you have. Agriculture has always given Nebraska a tremendous base. But from that, insurance companies got started, banks got started, manufacturing got started, and now media platforms. I think you're right at the cusp of a lot of good things happening. But what's critical to that, as Bob knows, because he was governor of Nebraska, it's the quality of leadership. I mean, that always determines the future of anything and anybody, not just public leadership, but private leadership. And Nebraska has been blessed, I think, over many years that it's had good public, religious, private, commercial, educational leadership.
Yeah, well, thank you both, and thanks for your kind words about Lutheran Family Services. We are honored to be in this work, and we don't do it alone. So it's great to have partners in the unicameral and with our congressional delegation, as well as partners of goodwill and donors to help assist in providing the services that so many people need, and more than ever, to your astute points. Since 2014, LFS, as you know, has helped Nebraska welcome over, and this is a remarkable number just given the size of the state, over 4,000 refugees to Nebraska. And we provide job counseling and English language training, mental health support, cultural orientation, just a handful of the services that we offer to newcomers to the state. And I'm wondering, Senator Kerry, as Senator, you served on the Intelligence Committee, and Secretary Hagel, as Senator, you served on the Committee on Foreign Relations, as well as the Intelligence Committee, and then later, of course, as Secretary of Defense. From these experiences, I wonder if you both speak about the important contributions that newcomers, especially refugees, have made to our armed forces and also to our communities.
Well, I look at this, it's a projection of the value. I mean, obviously, there's limits on how many refugees America can take, but the fact that people are queuing up wanting to come to the United States of America tells the rest of the world, particularly we just had a big confrontation between our Secretary of State and the Foreign Minister of China, comparing each other's values. People are not queuing up wanting to go to China as a consequence of being free. They know they can be free in the United States of America, and there really is something to the old maxim that says that if you work for something, you value it more than if it's given to you. And my citizenship was given to me, and whereas the refugee or the immigrant has to work for it. And as a consequence, they value it more, and they tend to have a higher level of service. And it leads, by the way, to something I should have said earlier about the pandemic, which is, Nebraska is fortunate to have the leadership. Chuck mentioned leadership, but the leadership of Dr. Gold at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, what they've done, not just in Omaha, but statewide. They were the leader in Ebola. They've been turned to, again, they're building the capacity to have readiness available to if there's another pandemic in the future. And they've got a very large international workforce. And it's not just, as I said, not just in the city of Omaha. I watched a couple of conversations that Dr. Gold has had on the RFD network, talking to rural communities where they tend to have higher levels of poverty and greater need and greater healthcare challenges. So UNMC is a tremendous resource. And I'd be surprised if, I think every single member of the Nebraska legislature who's listening knows that and been supportive of trying to make them more successful.
Well, I again would echo Bob's last comments about Dr. Gold and UNMC and what they have done. When I was Secretary of Defense and presided over the Ebola crisis, one of the first calls I made was to Dr. Gold, and he flew in the next day to meet with the president and the Secretary of HHS and me at the White House. And he got UNMC very involved because they had an infectious disease center that very few medical centers had. And so they have been right at the forefront for years. And Bob's right to point out that asset, that tremendous treasure that sits there in Nebraska called UNMC. But in addition to the comments Bob made on refugees, and I agree completely, but you look at the history of refugees in Nebraska going back to the turn of the century, 20th century, Russian immigrants, Italians, Irish. I mean, they have all come here. The Vietnamese, as Bob and I know, they after the fall of Vietnam in 1975, Nebraska probably proportionally took as many or more than any other state. Minnesota took a lot. We had East Africans in the 90s and so on. So we've had a history, a tradition of accepting immigrants, and they have added so much value to our communities. They've enriched our communities in every way. Not just they work hard, they educate their children, they're good family people, they want to improve the community. But boy, it is the essence of America. I mean, we're all immigrants. We all came over here some way. Very few of us, our ancestors were born here. And so I think that's one of the unique qualities about the country and how we see the world, and why human rights and respect for others has always been so critical to who we are. We haven't always lived up to that, and we've made mistakes, but we keep trying to be better. So refugees really are very much the future. And Bob's exactly right. Nobody's breaking down the door to get into China or Russia or anywhere else. It's the United States, and there's a good reason for that.
Yeah, at risk of, by the way, at risk of demonstrating that even after 20 years, I could be a bit of a windbag. I do want to make 2 points. One is in regards to medical center. I've actually been back to Nebraska a fair amount the last couple of years because the medical center saved my daughter's life, who was diagnosed with breast cancer about 18 months ago. And I've got a number of friends. When you get to this age, you have lots of friends that are going in and out of surgery. And one of them went to the VA first, and then transferred over to the medical center. And to the legislators there, I have one of my great failures recently is I've not quite got it done. But that clinic that's built at the VA, that should have Chuck Hagel's name on it. Now he's nodding. He didn't know what I was going to say. He started nodding before I got to the punchline. But I've talked to the Legion. I've talked, and we've got to get the full support of the service organizations. But that's a spectacular accomplishment by Chuck. But it's also a great example of, and I know Lutheran Family Service knows it, of the importance, not just of the private sector, but that donor community that just keeps giving and giving and giving to build these spectacular institutions in the state.
Yes, I mean, first, I hope that your daughter is in full recovery.
She is.
I'm glad that she was able to get assistance here. That's remarkable. And to your point about philanthropy, Nebraska, part of what makes Nebraska a great place to live is because it is so philanthropic, and that's evidenced in institutions like Lutheran Family Services, UNMC, and all of the institutions and partners with which we're privileged to work for such good cause. I wonder if the two of you could speak very briefly about how refugee resettlement is part of a national security strategy, both for home and abroad, for the U.S.
Well, I'll let Chuck take it. It's basically, in many cases, it's keeping our promise. We've got allies that fought with us in Iraq, allies that fought with us in Afghanistan. And so some of it is just, a piece of it is just, are we going to keep our word? Are we going to do what friends ought to do? But I think it's demonstrable, and I'm so proud of not just Lutheran Family Services, but Nebraska in general for the welcome mat that's out, because it surprises a lot of people that on a per capita basis, we're the leader in terms of welcoming refugees to the state.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Bob's right. Not only is it our responsibility, but it's the right thing to do. And it, as I said earlier in my comments, it enhances our state. It makes us a better state for many, many reasons. It just enriches our culture, our society, our children, our education. And refugees are very innovative. They've had to be to survive. And they bring a dimension that I think Americans tend to forget. We're almost 75 years past World War II. And since this is my editorial comment about education, since we don't teach civics anymore in public schools, we don't really teach geography or history anymore in public schools. I mean, we're educating young people who don't know anything about World War II. Oh, I remember my grandfather was in it, I wasn't there or something. A society can't continue unless you learn the lessons of the past. And one of the things that refugees do and immigrants do, they force us to understand a little bit about our past, and because of their situation, where they came from, where they fled from, and why. And so I think it's so enriching to have them. And there's a generosity of spirit that Bob mentioned Nebraskans have always had. And I'm as proud about that as any one thing about Nebraska, being a Nebraskan, born and raised in Nebraska, about the generosity of spirit. I mean, we argue about politics and different things, that's okay. But when it comes down to the real important things in life, we're pretty much all on the same page, and we don't want to lose that. And the way you don't lose that, the way you preserve that, is to understand where you've come from and your past and a little history.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll just add two things to what Chuck said there. I completely agree with everything that Chuck just said. And if you look at the 1975 welcoming of the refugees from Vietnam, and they were running from the communists, it was 1.5 million that came to the United States. It was not popular. And what it made it possible were two politicians in Washington, D.C. who found common cause, Gerald Ford and Ted Kennedy, two unlikely partners in that venture. And my guess is they both got a little bit of grief for doing so. And if you have any question about the power of welcoming refugees to the United States of America, go shop at Borsheim's or Nebraska Furniture Mart. Those are two individuals that fled pogroms and Belarusia and came to Omaha, Nebraska, and built great businesses. So you don't have to look very far to find examples of why welcoming refugees is a really powerful thing to do.
Well, or look very far to note Nebraska, because Gerald Ford is also from the state of Nebraska, to know that we live and breathe welcome here. And the unicameral is designed to create a bipartisan spirit. And I think that's also a testament to how Nebraska understands what it means to roll up sleeves and work together. And speaking of rolling up sleeves and working together, both of you served our country in Vietnam, and Lutheran Family Services is really honored to serve over 400 veterans and family members annually with our direct services, and then to touch the lives, to assist in some way over 1,500 veterans and families annually with referrals and community events. So the services that LFS provides veterans include direct mental health therapy, peer support, financial assistance, transportation, and suicide prevention programming. Again, as veterans yourselves and as a former Secretary of Defense, I'm wondering if you can speak about the priorities that the state or the country should consider as it addresses mental health needs of veterans and their families. I mean, you both have spoken to some degree about the necessity for expanding behavioral health services, but I'd love to hear from you related to veterans specifically and mental health.
Well, since we've been doing it all morning here, I'll lead again. But both Chuck and I, and in fact, he was there long before I was at the VA and paying attention to what happens when a man or woman comes home. And it's gotten worse in many ways because in the Vietnam War, you deployed and you came home. Maybe you had to deploy again, but in the War on Terror, which was going on for 20 years now, they go over, they come back, they go over, they come back. And, if you ask 100 American citizens, do we have a war going on in Afghanistan? Is anybody in Afghanistan right now? They probably say no. So the disconnect, thanks to I think it was a good idea, the all volunteer service between, say, the main civilian population, the military, is quite stark. And it creates, I think, a need for, again, organizations like LFS who can come in and say, we've got Nebraskans that are contemplating suicide. We've got Nebraskans that feel lonely and isolated, and they're having a great deal of difficulty adjusting to civilian life. And we not only should help them, we can.
Well, I would just add to that, the last 20 years of constant war, and we've been in war in 2 locations for 20 years. And starting with the 20th anniversary, we're going to have on September 11th of this year of what happened in New York and at the Pentagon when we were attacked. That has been part of our lives for 20 years. The threat of terrorism in different ways, different dynamics. I mean, cyber terrorism. But the military has borne a real brunt, because what we've seen in those 2 long wars, the 2 longest America's ever been in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we're still there in both, is the same people going back over and over and over. And when I was at the Pentagon, I would talk to these guys all the time, and then I was obviously in Afghanistan and Iraq a number of times as I was a senator, but it was not uncommon to find tours, all our servicemen and women who had 5, 6, 7 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, 12-month tours. Now, when Bob and I were in Vietnam, I mean, the tour was 12 months. I mean, so if you could get out in 12 months and you were home safe, they weren't going to send you back. I mean, you could volunteer to go back. But because the all volunteer force, and I agree with Bob, that was the right thing to do. I wouldn't want to go back to a draft for a lot of reasons. Army, no, it's a professional army, and that's what you need. But it's really taken a mental toll that the American people don't see. And we have record suicides every day in this country by active duty and veterans. And boy, that really tells you something, because there's so much other news crowding the front pages, and the amount of time can be given to television newscasts and the radio, that gets kind of pushed aside. So it's up to the VA, it's up to Lutheran Family Services to help. But it's a community responsibility, I think, because only 1% of the American population serve in uniform. 1%.
Wow.
And so we've kind of disconnected. And that's why I always believe that veterans groups are so important, because veterans groups keeps at least the reality and the connection of veterans and back in their communities and their business leaders, educational leaders, their doctors. And that's really important. I think reserves and National Guard are important for that reason too. They're important for a lot of other reasons, but because it's your local community individuals who are members of the reserves and National Guard. So it's a serious problem. It's a deep, widespread problem that I think we need to pay more attention to. And thankfully, organizations like yours do pay a lot of attention to it. And I know a state like Nebraska, a smaller state that pays attention to these things, do better at this than most other states.
Chuck, I am paying attention to what you're saying, but is that a picture of you with the Beatles over your right shoulder back there? That
Jerry, we've got to get you back to some semblance of discipline. You were doing pretty well for about a half hour, then you veer off into that. No, actually, what that is, that's a picture of my brothers and me.
Oh.
Nobody's going to want to hear this, but you asked a damn question, Carrie. You got me into this. I'm the oldest of four boys. My father died when I was in high school. My brother Tom and I, who you know Tom well, so we get out of high school, we go to Vietnam, serve together. So when we come back from Vietnam, I got back December of '68. Tom got back January '69. 7 years after my dad had died, my mother remarried. And that picture was taken at her wedding.
Oh my gosh.
June 14th, 1969, my brothers and me. So, but they'll be
That's
flattered.
Great.
They'll be flattered to know that you considered them Beatles. And thank you.
Well, Senator Kerry asked the question we were all wondering. So if nothing else, we were wondering. I was in his camp there. So I'm glad the mystery's been solved. Thank you. Both of you talked a little bit about out of sight, out of mind. And I'm wondering how you brought, and continue to bring in your work, how you brought the experience as a veteran to your perspectives and how you shaped policy priorities and how that sort of frames the work that you currently do.
Well, look, in my case, it's I just think of two things quickly. One is just constantly be grateful. I mean, I came home alive, and lots didn't. And I had a great family and friends, and my church. I mean, they helped me get through it, and it was really, really important. And I had the government as well. But secondly, I mean, I can't think of very many things other than jokes I tell from time to time about Chuck Hagel that I've done alone. So it's about giving other people credit for things you get done. So it's not easy to maintain that attitude. Sometimes I can be a jerk, but most of the time I'm successful making the effort, and I'm grateful to others who have helped me.
Well, I think Bob's answer was a good answer, except the jokes about me. But other than that, it was a serious thing. Well, Bob's right. I think most veterans feel, especially Vietnam veterans or any combat veterans, when they come home, if they get home, they're grateful. And they're grateful for all the reasons Bob said. Bob went through a much, much tougher situation than I did. What he had to endure in hospitals and all the rest that went with his injury, and that partially he got recognized with the Congressional Medal of Honor for, but he had a lot tougher than I did. And he spent a lot of time with people who were really in bad shape. I think of our friend Max Cleland, triple amputee and so on. And Lou Polar, who obviously there was a very close friend of Bob's who lost both legs. His father was famous Marine General Chesty Puller, and Bob was in the Philadelphia, I think, Naval Hospital with him recuperating.
That's right.
And I got to know him a little bit, and he committed suicide. I mean, so you had friends. I've had 3 friends that I was in. Tom and I, my brother and I, were in Vietnam with, commit suicide. They had families and so on. So you are grateful, as Bob said, for what you've been able to have in your life because of friends, because of church, because a lot of institutions that helped you through it. And what you do, at least and I think Bob's this way too, from my perspective, and I'm not unique on this at all, is you try to apply everything you learned, all the lessons you learned, good and bad, to everything you're doing. And I think in public office that Bob and I have both had the privilege of participating in the high offices that we've held, and the jobs that he's had as president of a big university and so on. I don't think there's a day goes by that you don't apply some lesson that you learned. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, or wherever. Certainly, if you don't have to be in combat, I don't think necessarily in the military, but that's been the way for me, that I applied some lesson. When Bob and I were in the Senate, I mean, bills that came up regarding national defense, security, anything that touched on military, I mean, I'm sure, Bob, like me, you thought about your own experiences. Obviously, when I was Secretary of Defense, hardly a decision I made, I didn't put myself back in that situation. Going through basic training as a private and so on, experiences I had in combat. But it's, it's like all of us in life, you draw from your own experiences from your childhood on, and hopefully that helps you and you get a little wiser as you get older, because you make enough mistakes. But I think that's the way I've looked at it.
I think the idea of gratitude is not only a lovely idea, but one that's grounded in a lot of the responses that Nebraskans have to people in need. It comes out a sense of gratitude for being in such a philanthropic and great place to live. It's part of why we see the responses that we do. And it's also, I think, of equity. So there are many of us who have positions of equity that are inequitable. Many of us have more than others, in part because of disparities. And Lutheran Family Services works to help create equity where we can along social determinants of health. And the pandemic, as both of you alluded to in earlier comments, has highlighted just how urgent this work is in creating health equity. And as both of you know, historically, marginalized communities have suffered disproportionately high rates of illness and death compared to white Nebraskans, who have the lowest overall mortality rate for any number of reasons associated with the social determinants of health. And Nebraska happens to be a state with one of the highest wealth disparities in the country. Nebraska's difference in poverty rates between white and minority groups is also higher than the national average. So a couple of examples of this: poverty among Native Americans in Nebraska was 15% higher than the national average, and poverty among Black Nebraskans was 6% higher than the national average for Black Americans in poverty. So my question to you both is, the COVID-19 pandemic has really shined a spotlight on health inequities that have existed in our communities for a long time. And from your respective vantage points, what do you see as some solutions or approaches that could help Nebraska narrow the gap and level the playing field? And if not Nebraska, sort of the US, if you'd rather take it more writ large.
Well, I guess first of all, I'd start with, I think, a reasonable presumption, which is, I think Nebraskans care about that there is inequities, that there still is a substantial amount of poverty, whether it's by race or ethnicity or geography. It's not something that you have to say, well, Nebraskans don't care. They do care about it. And I think that we just have to follow the answers. What's worked? Housing matters, transportation matters, education matters. But I'll give you a concrete example. And it doesn't solve all the problems. I mean, that's one of the challenges when you're dealing with something like you've just served up to us. is there isn't one sort of magic things that solves all those problems. I actually chair a board called Monolith in Lincoln, Nebraska. Governor Ricketts has been enormously helpful. We're converting basically natural gas into carbon black and hydrogen that's going to be converted into anhydrous ammonia. The average salary at that company is $80,000 to $100,000 a year. Well, at $80,000 to $100,000 a year, you can support a family. So we have to look, it seems to me, for ways to solve a number of problems along the way. But I don't think there's much better than if you can actually create jobs that generate enough income for that individual to support their family.
Yeah, I would add to what Bob said, and I agree with his points. Awareness is critical. The awareness of society, of your population, that these disparities are there. They're real, and they affect people. And as Bob said, all different varieties. I mean, not just a certain ethnic group or religious group or geographic group. So it's everything Bob noted. It's housing, it's jobs, it's education. I think education is really critical here, especially the lower grades, to give these young kids a chance in life at every level, that grade school, high school, as they start to mature and get out on their own. But it's got to be a community-wide effort, it seems to me, including all the things that Bob's talked about that I've just mentioned, in order to address it. And I think also how Bob started, that I think he's right. I think Nebraskans do care about it. You have different opinions on how to fix it. More government services, less government services. I get all that, but we need it all. We need government help. We need private sector help. We need everybody in this. And I think the more unity of purpose that you can bring and leadership that attaches to that implements that unity of purpose,
I agree.
That's the way to get it done.
Yeah, and I think part of what's unique about Nebraska, to your point, that Nebraskans care, is our tradition of bipartisanship, which leads me to one of my last questions. You know, Lutheran Family Services has a 125-year legacy partnering with churches, individuals, elected representatives from all political backgrounds and faith traditions. And even our board is represented in this way. We're unique among Lutheran organizations in that we've got leadership from 2 Lutheran judicatories that actually work together. So if you know anything about Lutherans, that's really unique and terrific. And so from these experiences, LFS knows that there's much more that unites us as Nebraskans and Americans than divides us. But we do this work against a backdrop in which recent polling from Pew Research found that 8 in 10 registered voters, Democrats and Republicans, felt that the differences that divided the 2 political parties were about core American values, while roughly 90% of registered Democratic and Republican voters worried that the election of a president from the opposing party would lead to lasting harm in the United States. And as former colleagues in the Senate with different party affiliations, I would love it if you could speak about the importance of working across the party aisle and what difference bipartisanship not only has that made in your careers, but what difference can bipartisanship make for the citizens of Nebraska or folks in the US?
Well, I mean, my experience is the most difficult, the most important things to do when it comes to legislation or policy in general are issues. We take immigration, entitlement, healthcare. These are issues that, unless it's bipartisan, it's just way too easy to demagogue it from either the right or the left. I mean, we got 30% of the American people only go to YouTube to get their news. And it creates polarization. It's not just division, it's polarization where people are lined up and they're not willing to, on left and right, to stay open to the possibility that they're wrong. So I think if you want to get immigration done or healthcare or entitlements, or pick an issue, You need a Democrat that will defend a Republican from attacks on the left, and a Republican who will defend the Democrat from attacks on the right. The problem is both parties tend to punish in primaries. When if I work with a Republican, I could get primary to Democratic primary and vice versa. So a lot of this gets back to us, the people. We citizens are we going to tolerate the kind of compromise necessary to get important things done? Because if we don't expect the Congress to do it on their own.
Well, I would add to what Bob said. Let's remember that the entire process starts with the citizen. It starts at the ballot box. Every voter going to vote for the governor, the senator, the congressman, the president, whoever. That's where it starts. And Bob's point on this is about citizenship and responsibility here is exactly right. It's got to start in the community with the citizens, with the people. Then that works out. I'll give you a quick story. When I first got to Washington, I was elected in '96, and Bob and I knew each other before I got elected. I mean, we were big buddies, but we knew each other. And so when I first got there, and Luann Linehan was my chief of staff, Bob said to me, first week I was there, why don't you and I get together and figure out how we can work together? And on the things we can't agree on, we won't agree on. So Bob put together a list, he and his chief of staff put together a list of things that we could work together on behalf of Nebraska and behalf of the United States. He didn't know me that well. That generally thought the other things we're not going to agree on. So Luann Linehan and I went over to Bob's office and spent an hour and a half with him and his chief of staff. And we went through a whole list of things where we can agree, we'll work together, we'll be joined on this for the state, the country. We also agreed that where we disagree and where we have differences, how we voted, differences, so on, we'd make our case and argue like hell, whatever it took, but we would not use it against the other guy. And that was the key. I don't know if that ever happens today, but I tell you, a Democrat, Republican with a small state, we're trying to maximize our influence for our little state. If you don't do that, then your state suffers and your people suffer because you're fighting all the time. You're trying to really screw the other person. And everything that the other person says or does, politically, you're trying to hurt him or her with people back in your state. If that's the way you're going to approach this, there'll be disaster, and it'll be disaster for the country because democracies have to compromise. I mean, I've never met anybody so smart that knows everything about everything. Maybe somebody's out there, but I haven't met him. I've not ever seen a political party that has all the answers and the other party is all wrong. We've allowed a certain absolutism, almost like religion, to seep into our politics and govern so much of our politics. And as Bob said, it's at the primary level. I mean, you're penalized today in the Congress if you co-sponsor a bill, if you're a Republican with a Democrat or a Democrat Republican, they'll come after your own party. I mean, I remember my last couple of years because I disagreed with President Bush on Iraq and said it was a mistake and we're going to pay a high price and so on and so on. Although my voting record was the #1 voting record in support of President Bush for the last 2 years for his issue. It wasn't Iraq, it wasn't foreign policy, but yet oh my God, I was a rhino, I was a traitor to our country, to our party. And I just add one last thing, that unicameral that we have in Nebraska, they understand this very well. And George W. Norris and all those who brought it in many, many years ago. This is something I used to say on the Senate floor when I would get vilified by my own party and called names. I took an oath of office. We all took an oath of office. We all took the same oath of office. It's not to a party. It's not to a president. It's not to a philosophy. It's to the Constitution. It's to the country. And as long as you follow that, you're going to be okay. But I think your question is a really critical question for the future. Because there's only one alternative to democracy, and that's authoritarianism. So why do we need this messy politics and messy institutions called Congress? We just fight all the time. Why don't we have one president just makes all the decisions and tells us all what to do? Wouldn't that make much easier? Well, so I don't want that for my kids and my grandkids. Maybe the rest of America does. I sure as hell don't. And we better sober up and get this right, because we won't have a lot more chances here until we do. China is not waiting for us. The rest of the world's not waiting for us. They've lost confidence in us. They've lost trust in us. And that's very dangerous because of what Bob talked about, the polarization and the paralysis that's brought on in our government. And we'll pay a high price if we don't change that.
Yeah, I mean, having lived in Turkey, we certainly don't want Erdogan to become what we aspire to. I think your point is a good one, and a reminder that the good life doesn't come without an eye toward the common good is a helpful way to end a conversation about what makes Nebraska a great place and the work that we have ahead as citizens and those of us who are united to help create one of the best places to live and work in the country. Before we close, I just want to say that there were some questions that we didn't get a chance to attend to, so my apologies there. But I do appreciate the questions that came across through the chat, and if at all possible, we'll try to get some of those answered offline. I know everyone's busy, so we're going to wrap up in a timely fashion. We need to be committed to the timelines that we've committed to. I do want to note that I'm deeply, deeply grateful for today's distinguished guests, Secretary Hagel and Senator Kerry. Thank you, both of you, for serving as today's panelists and for the inspiring and honest conversation that you let us listen to. And thank you to our legislative partners in Lincoln and for your dedication to Nebraska's citizens and for attending today's event. And a special word of thanks to Caitlin Reese from Catalyst for coordinating all of this. Not only is she great at coordinating, but she's a terrific friend. So thanks, Caitlin. And in closing, just quickly, I wanted to share that after 3 years of leading Lutheran Family Services to sustainable growth and increased mission impact, I'm stepping down from my role as president and CEO, effective toward the end of next month. And my departure is earlier than I had hoped or anticipated, but I've got some family issues that compel me to relocate to Columbus, Ohio, where I'll assume the role of president and CEO of Lutheran Social Services of Central Ohio. It seems that I can't shake Lutherans. So although I'm leaving the state, I'll be in the Lutheran fold.
I'm sorry.
I'm sure I'll be seeing you.
Sorry to lose you.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I'm sorry to have to be going. I've loved my time here, but the organization's in great hands. And it's a terrific board, so the transition I know will be a smooth one. So anyway, a sincere thanks again to the distinguished panelists. Thank you again, Secretary Hagel and Senator Kerry. And Lutheran Family Services looks forward to our continued partnership with leaders in Lincoln and across the great state of Nebraska and Washington, D.C. as well, as we create a brighter future for everyone who calls Nebraska home.
Thanks, Stacy. And
Thank you.
thanks to all our state senators for your work, what you do, and the staff.
Special thanks to them, yes.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Chuck. Bye.
Good to see you.
Take care. Thank you.